All right, hi. We're going to start the first video lecture of the semester. We're opening up the semester with this video presentation, which is going to initiate the very first topic of the semester. If we can just go to the outline here of the first part. So, if you remember in the class introduction, the video that I posted on Monday, it indicates, as well as in the syllabus, of course, that the semester is going to be organized or divided into three main historical periods. There will be three historical periods that is going to address different and unique eras of Texas history. And we're starting the first part, the first third of the semester, and every historical period is going to, at the same time, cover three themes or three topics. So we're starting the very first part of our course, and we're going to be looking at in this historical period, the indigenous Spanish and Mexican backgrounds of Texas. So again, we're really going back in time to the very early formative stages of Texas, which is going to take us all the way back to the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Texas up to 1492. This is going to be our first topic that we're starting. We're starting today. And again, there's going to be about 3 class meetings or 3 video lectures per topic, give and take. I mean, this is just an average. In this first part that we're initiating, the indigenous Spanish and Mexican backgrounds, we're going to start again in the very ancient world of the Americas. We're going to look very generally at the peoples that inhabited the Americas, just to understand their origins, their stages of development, some of their social and cultural developments as well, some of their features, again, of the distinctiveness of those cultures in very general terms. And then we're going to pay attention, of course, to the peoples of Texas itself. Again, so we're going to look at the groups that settled in this region, and just understanding what kind of social, cultural, religious, again, features they develop here in this region, again, up to 1492. So again, this is a pre-Columbian history, before Columbus, that is to say. Columbus arrives in 1492, so we're really just looking at, again, the background, the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Texas up to this time. Again, there will be 3 video lectures, 3 class meetings done on this topic, and then we're going to be moving into the Spanish exploration and colonization of Texas, or the Spanish background, that is to say, because in 1492 Columbus discovers America on behalf of Spain, and the Spaniards are going to arrive, so the forerunners of exploration and colonization, the first Europeans, in other words, that are moving into this new land that they found. They're beginning to explore it and establish settlements and colonies. Again, in some of those regions that they explored and settled was Texas. Again, and so we're going to look at the formation of Spanish Texas, and of course, looking at the interaction with Native American groups as well. So it's important to look at those interactions. So we're not just going to assess, the Spanish presence and their, towns and their institutions in Texas, but there's going to be, of course, interaction with the Native American groups. And there will be 3 videos done on this topic, on the second topic, on Spanish exploration and colonization. And of course, the third topic we're going to cover is Texas in the Mexican nation, because at some point the Spanish colonies in America are going to move towards independence from Spain, beginning in 1810. And Texas back then was part of the colony of New Spain that encompassed present-day Mexico and the American Southwest. And Texas was part of that larger colony called New Spain. And of course, when New Spain moved towards independence and achieved its independence in 1821, New Spain, the colony, becomes now Mexico, the independent nation of Mexico. And Texas was, from 1821 to 36, part of this new project, this new Mexican nation. And we're going to look at that as well, this process of independence, the participation of Texas in the independence movement, and of course how Texas entered the phase of nationhood with, as part of Mexico. Again, it was a province, or a state, province, state of Mexico. And we're going to look at that period as well. So those are going to be the 3 topics, the first 3 topics of the semester that are part of the first historical period. This is really the formative period of Texas, the indigenous Spanish and Mexican backgrounds. Okay, so each, as I said, theme is going to take about 3 videos, so or 3 sessions, class sessions. Again, they're going to be recorded and posted on Blackboard. So this is the first session of the first topic on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. All right, so now let us go to our lecture outline. So this is the lecture outlines that I present to class. I put the outlines on the projector for students to actually view the key terms, the concepts, the ideas, the train of thought, in other words, of the discussion. So that way you have an idea what we're talking about, of course, and you'll be able to take notes and be able to write down exactly the names of the people or the places or the ideas, again, that we're actually elaborating. It's a kind of train of thought. It's just to keep students, again, focused on a train of thought, that this is a theme that is being discussed very thoroughly from its origins. Again, whatever that we're studying, we're going to look at origins or causes, and then development and outcome. Okay? It's a very structured organization. So again, this is the grand title, Indigenous Peoples of the Americas in Texas up to 1492. Please write that on your notes. This is the first topic, and every time we initiate a session, I will remind you where we are, by the way. And I have also provided a table of contents, so you know the main components of the lecture as well. So this is a table of contents of the parts or the segments that we're going to be discussing. And we start with a general overview. What I like to do here is first talk about the indigenous peoples of the Americas in very general terms, in that I introduce the topic. Why is it significant to discuss the indigenous peoples of the Americas? And of course, Texas is going to be looked at, of course, closely in the latter portion of the topic, but it's important to understand the significance, have a general overview. We're going to look at the origins of the Native American peoples, just understanding, again, in academia, what are the assumptions or theories about where Native peoples in the Americas come from. We're going to look at the stages of historical development. It's very important because to fully understand any people, by the way, that we study, it's very important to look at how those societies developed over time. What kind of ideas, beliefs were important to them, the world of meanings, how they provided meaning to the world, so we can understand, again, their societies, so we can understand their social institutions, their political institutions, their traditions, their practices. So it's important to look at development. Okay, so Native Americans, as well as many peoples around the world, have gone through stages of development that took thousands of years to accumulate certain knowledge, to accumulate certain experiences that allow them to adapt to the environment, different types of environments, of course, and create, their own civilizations. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at the indigenous peoples of North America, because Texas is in North America. So we're just going to look briefly at the indigenous peoples of North America and pay close attention and the variety or diversity of groups that existed, of course, in North America. And of course, at the end, we're just going to focus on the peoples of Texas. So you'll see how Texas was fitting in the larger picture, how the peoples of Texas, in many cases, came from other parts of North America, settled and brought, certain knowledge or certain ideas that, groups actually accumulated in different parts of North America and so on. So we're going to look closely towards the end, again, at the indigenous peoples of Texas up to 1492. So this is in very general terms, the table of contents. And now we may proceed then to begin now the lecture on the indigenous peoples of the Americas in Texas by initiating with a general overview. Again, this is just a very, very general overview of this topic that begins to present the larger picture of the indigenous peoples of the Americas to students, so students have an idea, again, that in this continent, which is, a gigantic landmass, by the way, prior to the arrival of Columbus in 1492, was inhabited by millions of people. It is estimated, according to archaeologists and historians, those who study the past, that is to say, that by 1492 there were anywhere between 80 to 120 million peoples living in the continent of America, and they were all, of course, scattered across the continent. So again, it is the estimate. Again, there was back then no census to speak of, or written records that people actually kept about specifically, the number of people that lived in villages or in certain cities that existed back then. So yes, so there has been, of course, serious research and studies done by historians that have recollected, information about the accounts, the memoirs, the writings of explorers and Spanish explorers or Spanish colonial officials that lived in the 1500s in the Americas, in various parts of the continent. And through the recollection of those accounts, those official reports by the European colonists, we're able to more or less reconstruct, of course, how many people lived in this region, in this continent. So again, it's just an estimated that there were anywhere between 80 to 120 million peoples that lived in the entire continent, from North America, the far reaches of North America, present-day Alaska, all the way to South America. So it is also estimated through a reconstruction of past history that those 120 million inhabitants, give and take, many of them, not all of them, but many of them actually lived in what today we will call nations. Okay, there were about 500 Native American nations at the time of Columbus' arrival to the Americas in 1492. So what a nation is an organized society that has laws. They have their own internal norms or laws or social codes of behavior, that they have political rulers, political institutions, for example, that they have some form of economic system that organizes people to produce goods for the survival of the group. And also, a nation is based on the notion that those groups also are settled in claim specific geographical areas. So they have territorial, again, locations that they claim and that they live, and so they have certain boundaries, so to speak, that they protect or defend. In other words, so again, there were about 500 of those entities, political entities or political communities, that were organized in various different levels, of course, all scattered across the Americas. So it was a very, very, again, diverse type of, peoples in the Americas, in that there were so many of them, again, 120 million, and there were, of course, so many different nations as well across the landscape. Now, what's important to note is that another feature of the indigenous peoples of the Americas is that they were extremely diverse, culturally speaking, because all of the Americas, when you look at the continent, just the geography itself, contains a wide variety of different climates, different types of terrains, different types of soil, and different types of vegetation and animal wildlife, for example. So as the Native Americans scattered and settled in different parts of the continent that had different environmental conditions, different ecological conditions, different flora, different fauna, vegetation, animals, and weather patterns, different climates, and so on. As they settled and adapted, they created a unique culture that resembled the kind of setting in which they live. Okay, so there was a great diversity among Native American peoples. They were, they cannot be cast into like a monolith or a single type of culture. So Native Americans were very different in many respects, just because they had, different cultural experiences, different cultural features that they created over thousands and thousands of years out of their interaction with the natural environment, because the natural environment was very diverse. So therefore, they created unique and very distinct cultures from one another. different tools that they crafted for their survival. They created also different economic strategies that allow them to survive as a group. Some of them rely exclusively on fishing, some of them on hunting, some of them on a combination of both. Some of them relied on farming, and so on and so forth. So it's a wide variety, again, of cultural manifestations across the Americas, from North America all the way to South America. So it's important to understand this diversity. And at the same time, this diversity can be seen also in the number of different languages and dialects that the indigenous peoples of the Americas actually developed over millennia, over thousands of years. It is estimated that when Columbus arrived in 1492, there were over 1,400 different linguistic groups in the Americas. In other words, those 120 million inhabitants of the Americas spoke over, again, you find again subgroups, in other words, major groups and subgroups that each actually spoke a different language. 1,400 plus linguistic groups. Okay, and some of them were, formal languages. Others were just variations of major languages of the mother language. For example, there were variations, there were dialects, so on and so forth. So wide array of different linguistic groups at the time of the contact. So this was a very rich, continent populated by peoples that settled pretty much and adapted to very different climates from the peoples that actually lived in Alaska, that adapted to a very cold type of climate and were able to adapt and survive there and create cultures, all the way to the peoples that actually adapted to the tropics, like in Central Mexico and South America, or the Caribbean islands, or in South America. So there's a wide variety, again, of experiences and languages, different types of cultures, and again, many of them were actually organized into nations. What we today we just simply call a nation. There were organized societies that has political structures, they had economic organization, social institutions. They have tools, what we call technologies in a certain sense. And of course, territorial, domains as well. They claim territories in many ways. So it's very diverse. So this is comparable to pretty much the other continents that we can actually study, like the European continent, for example. It's also very diverse. It has a wide array of different ethnicities, and different ethnicities settled in different parts of Europe and created their own distinct languages and cultures and so on and so forth. They're very diverse. The same can be said about the continent of Africa. Again, it's populated by hundreds and hundreds of different groups, each with their own distinct cultures and languages and so on and so forth. Or Asia, again. So there's a wide array of diversity in the continents that we actually study, and the Americas was no exception. Okay, so now having said that, now that we just generally introduce the topic, so you can understand, the background, if you will, of Native Americans. Now let us proceed to start now discussing the main components of this theme. And in the table of contents that I show you in the beginning, I indicate that we begin with understanding first and foremost the origins of Native American peoples. This is very important because whenever you study any Native American group from any part of the Americas, whether we're studying the Eskimos or Inuit of Alaska, or we're studying the Mississippians from the Mississippi River Valley, for example, or the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico in the Southwest, or we're studying the peoples of Texas, the indigenous peoples, indigenous groups of Texas, or we're studying the Maya of Central America or the Aztecs of Central Mexico. They have, of course, their own histories, and they tell stories and legends about where they come from. So it's important to understand that indigenous peoples have their own histories, they have their own stories that they tell and they pass on from generation to generation, that informs people of the origins, again, of their own group. And what's important to note is that many of those stories actually share many commonalities, many similar features. Whether you're studying the peoples of North America or South America, Central America, many of those creation stories, the stories of creation, the origin stories, the stories of the origin of the world, the origins of the group, tell the story of migration. That, again, the Native Americans actually migrated from other parts of the world. And it's just almost a universal concept among Native American groups, that when you study their own mythologies, they tell stories in many different ways, of course, of their group migrating from other parts of the world. Okay, so it's a very important thing. So they arrived to the Americas from elsewhere in the distant past, and they settled, and they created, of course, the group, and they created their culture. So now, having said that, scholars, in other words, historians and anthropologists in universities and colleges that actually study Native American history, also propose that Native Americans, the origins of the Native American peoples, go back to human migrations. That is to say, in other words, that the Native American peoples, okay, that inhabited the continent and that continue to live in the present day in many communities and villages and their own societies, they go back thousands and thousands of years to peoples that came from other parts of the world. Okay, so in academia, this assumption or view about the origins of Native Americans as migrant groups that came from different parts of the world is known as the diffusion theory. Okay, the diffusion theory. This is the most well accepted and established theory in academia that explains the origins of Native American groups, but it is also a theory that explains the origins of humanity at large. Okay, so what is the diffusion theory? So the diffusion theory, what it proposes is that humanity as a whole originated in Africa. So again, this diffusion theory, proposes that all humans, first and foremost, the human race, the human species, originated millions of years ago, perhaps 6 million years ago. Early humans, that is to say, early humans, 6 million years ago in the continent of Africa, perhaps even more. So, so far, archaeologists, those that study their fossil remains, the skeletons, of previous existences, indicate that the earliest records that we have found are in Africa. So again, everything points that Africa is pretty much the birthplace, the cradle of humanity. according to the record. So this is what scholars propose, that since the earliest bones of human beings, the early humans, are found in Africa. So again, the assumption is, well, maybe this is the place where it all started. So once in Africa, humans begin to appear on the scene. Okay, early humans. They live there presumably for some hundreds of thousands, perhaps even a few million years there, adapting to the environment of that continent. And so they, of course, try to adapt by looking or searching for the most essential elements that sustain life, that is water and food. And back then the source of food were simply wild animals that people hunted. So they stayed very close to bodies of water, because without water humans cannot exist, by the way, not for long. So they stayed close to rivers or ponds of water, lakes, and so on. And they also hunted animals in the landscape, the wide variety of different animals and so on. So they adapted there. This is their type of existence. Now, at some point, the diffusion theory, proposes that at some point humans are migrating out of Africa due to perhaps environmental changes, environmental weather changes, climatic changes that took place back then, in that perhaps there was a series of droughts that made life and survival harder and harder for people. And as there were a series of droughts that affected the African continent, people began to pursue the water and the food elsewhere. They had to move, in other words. So they began to diffuse out of Africa. So to diffuse is to spread out. When something is being diffused, is when it's being spread out, in other words. So the spreading of humanity upon the planet begins out of Africa, perhaps due to environmental changes, according to the theory. So we see, again, thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people moving into different areas of the world, like Europe. Some of them are migrating into places like the Middle East, Asia, even the continent of Australia. And at some point, some of those groups are going to make their way into the Americas. Now, how is it that people can simply just walk into the American continent from, let's say, places like Asia? Well, back in this time that we're talking about, prehistoric times, thousands and thousands of years ago, there was a bridge, a landmass that connected Asia and America. And that was a bridge that connected the top part of those two continents, the Asian continent and the American continent. The very, very north part, the northernmost part, were actually connected by a bridge or a landmass that today scholars called the Bering Strait. Okay, there was the Bering Strait. So people can simply just walk over, from Asia to the Americas through the Bering Strait. And this is how we're going to see, of course, people pouring into the American continent out of this diffusion of peoples out of Africa, again, that took place not overnight, but over thousands and thousands of years, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years, as people are moving out of Africa in pursuit of food and water, and they're settling in different parts of the world. People were always on the move. Again, they were always moving, chasing animals, hunting animals, and in that pursuit for survival, they were pretty much now exploring the world. Okay, trying to survive and adapt in different areas of the world. And some of those groups ended up coming all the way to the American continent through the so-called Bering Strait. And so there was, of course, some pouring of people into the American continent through this land bridge. But what is also stated on this theory, the diffusion theory, is that 40,000 years ago, there was a mass migration that took place. Massive migrations of people from Asia into the Americas through the Bering Strait, by the way, as a result of some very critical, very dramatic environmental conditions that occurred that affected the entire planet back then, something that scientists called an ice age. So again, 40,000 years ago, there was an ice age. An ice age occurred on the planet that made survival very difficult for a lot of people because, the Earth begins to cool down significantly and many places of the world begins to freeze. So the formation of ice sheets, the formation of glaciers in many parts of the world, again, began to take place very rapidly, and people began to migrate to areas that were more suitable for survival, and people were now chasing animals that were actually very keen, very aware of the environmental conditions, and as animals are now moving into areas like America again, there was hordes of animals like the bison, the buffalo, in other words, that was crossing from Asia to America through this Bering Strait. People began to follow those herds and pretty much follow the animals, and in pursuing, of course, the food, we're going to see a mass outpouring of peoples from Asia into the Americas 40,000 years ago, the so-called Bering Strait crossing. So this was a mass movement that took place. So again, this is the map that shows the diffusion theory that I just explained. The cradle of humanity, Africa, 6 million years ago, and then out of Africa, the diffusion of humanity begins over the course of thousands and millions of years. There's people moving into Europe, some people moving in, settling in the Middle East, some of them moving into Asia, others south into places like Australia. And again, this is the Bering Strait crossing. The Bering Strait crossing. This is the landmass or land bridge that I just referred to that existed back in this time, that allowed people to actually move. Animals also crossed. There was a massive migration that took place 40,000 years ago during the last ice age, in which many peoples from this part of the world, Asia, what today is called China, Mongolia, and India, people that have lived here for presumably hundreds of thousands, millions of years, are now moving into the Americas. Okay, by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, we just don't know. We just recollect data that there was a mass outpouring of people into this continent. And again, so what happens is that this ice age lasted for a few centuries. Okay, so the Earth was affected by the ice age for a few centuries, according to scientists. And the Earth during this time was very cold. There was a lot of ice that was formed in many places of the world. And whatever little rain there was, it could turn into ice very rapidly, or snow, of course. But what actually happened is that this ice age is going to come to a close eventually. Okay, so as the ice age ended and the Earth is beginning to stabilize and warm up, many of the ice sheets and glaciers that had formed in many of the continents are beginning to melt. Okay, and as the ice is melting, the sea level is now on the rise. And as the sea level rises, as a result of all the water being, of course, melted, from many parts of the world, the water returns to the oceans. In other words, it has been, defrosted. The water is melting. The ice is melting. Is returning to the oceans. The oceans are increasing their level. This Bering Strait, this landmass, is beginning to disappear from sight. Okay, so this narrow band of land that made it available for people to cross from one continent to the other is beginning to be underwater. Okay, the sea level is rising, so suddenly what happens is that this land bridge that connected the two continents disappears. Is now below sea level. It's underwater. Okay, so it's underwater now. And so what happens is, after the last ice age, all of the people that had migrated in the past, whether they migrated millions of years, in the past, or during the Bering Strait crossing during the ice age, suddenly all of the people that migrated to the Americas are going to be disjointed and disconnected from the peoples of the other side. So there's going to be now two different worlds. The old world of humanity, this is where the old world of humanity, where humanity actually started, Africa, Europe, Asia, Middle East, this is the old world. And of course, the continent of America, which the Europeans are going to call the New World when Columbus discovered America in 1492, because, from the perspective of the peoples of this part of the world, they had lost memories. They had lost all recollection that there was another continent and that there were people that actually moved and crossed into this region of the world. So again, there's going to be a disconnect, and we're going to see again now the peoples of the Americas developing on their own. The peoples that are now living in the American continent, that will be called the indigenous peoples of America, or Native Americans, are going to pretty much develop in isolation from the rest of the world, with very almost non-existent interaction with the outside, because presumably there was no interaction. Presumably, the two worlds lost track of each other and they did not know of each other. Presumably, this is what we know. So again, now the peoples that migrated to the American continent will have to now find a home in this new landmass and migrate and explore. Some of them are going to settle in the north part of the continent, what today we call Alaska and Canada. Some of them are continuing to migrate south into what today is present-day United States. Yet some other groups continue their journey still to the south, finding warmer and warmer climates, to places that today we call Mexico and Central America, and even South America. Again, so this is a journey that took thousands and thousands of years, and many of those groups that came to the Americas are going to be really settling in different places and adapting and creating their unique cultures as they moved along, as they found water, as they found plants or animals that they could actually live off of. They're going to actually stay in those places and create their unique societies, their unique cultures. All right. Just checking. All right. Okay, so another thing to to move into here, the second segment of this topic is the stages of development of Native American peoples. Now that we have a general understanding of the origins of Native American groups, that it's not just that scholars propose that Native Americans actually came from other places through mass migrations, the so-called diffusion theory, the diffusion of human groups out of Africa that came populated the earth, by the way, including the continent of America, but also that the indigenous peoples also have myths or have legends of those migrations. Is very striking. Again, so it's very important to understand that even Native Americans see the origins of their own tribes, of their own groups, of their own ethnic groups in that fashion, as their ancestors arriving from other parts of the world. And they talk about catastrophes as well. There was great catastrophes afflicting the world back then that forced people to migrate. So it's very important to see that relationship, that correlation, if you will, of stories. Now let's move into the second part of the topic, which is the stages of development of Native American peoples. So here, it's this segment is very significant because this is going to now assess how the groups that are now in the Americas, that are now cut off or disjointed from the rest of the world from the last ice age, how they're going to start developing their unique ways of life, their unique ways of looking at the world, the ideas that they created, the beliefs that they formed, the world of meanings and interpretations, and eventually, of course, their cultures and societies. So this is very important because if we don't pay attention to that development, that growth, if you will, and the experiences of natives in this part of the world over the course of thousands and thousands of years, this is not going to allow us to understand the Native American thought, how the natives think or how the natives thought in the past as they do in the present, particularly when they're going to encounter the Spaniards. Of course, when the Spaniards arrive, of course, there's going to be a lot of misunderstanding between the Spaniards and the natives, precisely because they brought different modes of thought, because they developed in different parts of the world, and they saw the universe, they saw life, they saw existence in very different ways, in very different lights. So in order to understand the peoples that we study, it's very important to understand their historical experiences, how people develop historically in where they live, understanding how they survived, how they adapted, and how they started pretty much creating things like beliefs, ideas, religious practices, and so on, and how they created, of course, their societies as well. So again, let's look at the stages of development of Native American peoples, and we're going to survey thousands and thousands of years worth of history, and you'll be able to learn here, you'll be able to see how over the course of time Native Americans are going to develop very unique ways of looking at the world. They're going to develop their own religions, their own ceremonies that were very meaningful to them, precisely because they developed over the course of time out of the interaction with the natural environment. Okay, so if we start from the very beginning, once the Native American groups, or the groups that migrated from Asia, are here in this part of the world, in the American continent, after the last ice age, when those groups find themselves now isolated from the rest of the world, they're going to go through a series of experiences, again, that shaped the way they're going to actually create their own societies and eventually their own civilizations. Okay, those experiences took place over thousands and thousands of years. Again, so we are going to assess the different phases of development that allow them to start building up certain ideas about the world, certain tools, and of course, their own cultures. So we start from the very, very beginning. Okay, the very, very first stage of development that Native Americans are going through, let's say from the last ice age 40,000 years ago, or 40,000 BC to 8,000 BC. Over those thousands and thousands of years, what Native Americans were experiencing was an age that scholars call the Stone Age, which, by the way, scholars propose that all over the world, the human species was going through the same age. So this refers to, according to scholars, by the way, a global age called the Stone Age. Scholars also term it the archaic informative stages of humanity. Okay, the archaic informative stages. In other words, the archaic is the most ancient phase of humanity that we can actually trace. Of course, humans have existed for millions and millions of years, but knowledge of those existences are very far removed from us, that the records are very limited. But what scholars propose is that around 40,000 years ago, humans entered a global age known as the Stone Age, in which they began to really develop certain tools. There's a sign of intelligence in that people are beginning to really craft different forms of tools that allow them to live in the environment and survive in the environment much, much better. And it's called the Stone Age because most of the technologies, most of the tools that humans developed during this time were made from stone. Stone and wood, but primarily stone. And so the technologies back then were mainly hunting tools. Okay, so what is a technology? A technology is a tool and the knowledge to build that tool that allows people to survive in the environment. And during this time, survival depended 100% from hunting. So therefore, since hunting was essential for the survival of people, from the survival of humans during this time, most of the tools were hunting tools. Humans actually crafted, of course, different varieties of tools, like axes, for example, flintstones, and so on. They grabbed a rock, they sharpened it, they created, of course, a weapon, and to go out into the woods, the forest, and be able to confront an animal and kill it. And so, over the course of thousands and thousands of years, what Native Americans did was use their creativity, their intelligence that they had back then, to actually craft tools from the elements of nature that allow them to survive better. And you can see the evolution of technology across those thousands of years by looking at the weaponry that people crafted over centuries and thousands of years, and the technology was becoming more and more sophisticated over time. You can see the evolution of knowledge in human creativity over this period of time as humans were becoming more and more knowledgeable, more crafted, and more skilled in terms of building better and better weapons for hunting. The bow and arrow is going to come much, much later in the advanced stages of the Stone Age. It was a high-tech tool, by the way. That's something that that you have to understand. That during this time, the technology was actually based on the use of stones for survival. It's called the Stone Age, and pretty much every age that scientists name is named after the technology that is primary, that is central for human survival. So there's many types of ages that humanity have gone through, and every age is termed after the type of technology. For example, today we're living in the information age, or the computer age, the digital age. Again, this is the main technology that we use for survival as well, to create a civilization, to sustain it, that is to say. So, at any rate, so during this time, most human beings lived in the Stone Age. They crafted tools from rocks and wood, and also it's called the Stone Age because people lived in caves. They used caves as shelters. They used caves as shelter is that they had to protect themselves from the natural environment, from wild animals, and so on. And so that was the main residence of people back then. But also, caves were the first temples, the first religious spaces or spiritual spaces of people living during this time. They used caves for worship, for worshiping their gods. So, the people that lived in the Stone Age were nomads, nomadic societies. So, what's a nomad? Well, nomads are people that are moving from place to place and have no permanent, place of residence or home. Okay, even though people lived in caves, those places were not permanent. They were temporary, because during this time, the people living in the Stone Age still depended upon water and animals for survival. So as long as the water was nearby and there was plenty and there were wild animals around, they will stay in that place. But as soon as the animals will leave, or there was a drought and the water will dry up, they had to leave. They had to move. And they were constantly moving from place to place. And they were really moving along the migration of animals. The patterns of animal migrations was essential for the nomadic societies of the Stone Age. The nomads always followed the herds of animals because that was the food supply. You always follow the food supply, okay? And animals constantly migrate, based on the seasons. Those are seasonal migrations. So people are constantly moving from place to place in the Stone Age. That was the norm, okay? You will not find a nested, settlement of people. There were no villages. There were, no communities, of any kind, because again, people follow the herds of animals from place to place. There were really small groups of nomads that lived close together. 5 people up to 50 people. The largest group was about 50 people that pretty much lived close together and that traveled together from place to place. So there were really small bands of people. It was not even a tribe. It was a band, again, of people, many of which shared familial connections, kinship, in other words, connections, in that they were related to one another, etc. By birth, many of them actually joined the band along the way. They became part of the band, in other words. So there was also, gender division of labor among the natives, in that during the Stone Age, among the bands, there was an understanding that the main strategy for survival was primarily hunting, the hunting of animals. In the Americas, we're talking about, in North America, for example, primarily it was the buffalo. Okay, when we talk about places like Canada or places like the United States, present day United States, there was no Canada or United States back then. It was just present day. So we're talking about, of course, the buffalo. When you look at further to the south, it's going to be the deer, for example, and other wildlife as well. So primarily it was hunting, but also humans sustain themselves from eating edible plants. So whenever there was nothing to eat from the killing of an animal, humans will have to rely on eating edible plants. They will eat certain types of roots, seeds, leaves, fruits, berries, etc., that they will stumble upon in the environment and try to sustain themselves as well. So it was hunting and gathering, again, kind of economic, strategy. So how they survived in the environment was by hunting, including fishing, of course, and also gathering. So those strategies, however, were conducted by an understanding, as I said, dividing the labor, if you will, between men and women. Again, there was a gender division of labor back then, in that the understanding was that, well, men are going to do the hunting, okay? That's their main responsibility. They will have to every day go out into the forest and the woods and try to, get some form of wildlife, wild game and so on, hunt it and kill it, or fish. And women and the elderly will have to go to the fields and collect the edible plants. So there was a gender division of labor, so to speak, that existed during the Stone Age. And so this was the understanding. Again, every day, both men and women will simply, divide. Men will go out to hunt. Women will have to just collect edible plants, and of course meet at a certain point of the day in order to actually share the resources that they both actually gathered or collected or hunted. Again, so there was the understanding that they had. Now, at the same time, just checking the time here. Okay, so we're gonna go for another 10 minutes. Okay, so at the same time, what also occurred is that the peoples living during those times are going to develop, of course, ideas, concepts about the world that they lived in. They're going to develop a religious worldview. Okay, the people living in the Stone Age are going to pretty much develop the foundation of a view of the world that will become the basis, really the cornerstone of the view of the world of Native American cultures pretty much all over the Americas, in the ways that they're going to start framing their main ideas of the world and what the world, how the world came into being, how the world works, what are the main forces that govern life, that govern the universe, and so on and so forth. They're going to start forming their religious worldviews, in other words, during the Stone Age. And again, this is going to be the kind of basis for Native American religious thoughts. Okay, the Stone Age was the foundation. It created the very first building blocks, again, of how natives are going to start really thinking about the world that they inhabited, in other words. Now, what's very, very significant here is that all across the Americas, and of course, what historians and religious scholars and anthropologists also suggest is that not only were the Native Americans really forming those ideas during the Stone Age, but when you look at pretty much the rest of humanity all over the world, whether you're looking at Europe or Africa, you're looking at Asia or Australia and so on, all over the world, people were also living in the Stone Age. People were also hunters and gatherers, and they were at the same time developing very similar ideas to the ones developed by natives in the Americas. Okay, so it's very, very striking because there seems to be a sort of seed idea that serve as the basis for world religions. In other words, that all of the religions of the world trace their origin to a seed idea that originated during the Stone Age, virtually everywhere around the world. Okay, so what is this seed idea? Okay, so this is what, again, I want to explain before we conclude this first session. The first seed idea was the idea that this is what Native Americans are actually developing at the same time that the peoples of Africa, Europe, again, peoples in Australia and Asia are developing, is that those hunters and gatherers developed the idea that the world that they lived in, that they couldn't really understand very well because they had a limited understanding of the world. Their intelligence was not yet developed. So, just to give you an idea, during this time, there's no formal language that people use. Languages are not yet developed. Okay, the way we speak today, for example, there was nothing of that sort. People use certain sounds, they mumble certain words, they use hand gestures, facial expressions to communicate during this time. So there was no formal structure, so there was no structured thought at the same time. So they had not yet developed writing during this time, writing that enabled them to create symbols that represented concepts and ideas to explain how the world works according to their own interpretation. So there was no scientific systems. In other words, there were no scientific models or theories that people created or formulated. So, nonetheless, people had to explain, what the world was, because that was a concern. Who are we? They pretty much, in their own minds, back then, raised those questions. What is the world? Why there's rain? Okay, why there's thunder? Why there's an earthquake? Who are we? Where do we come from? And why do we die? What happens to us when we die? So those were very, very important, concerns or preoccupations, if you will, that they had to provide meaning to it. So they began to develop religious ideas or religious beliefs that tried to explain that. They looked for comfort in the world, so they could really, feel a sense that it was meaningful to be alive. They had to provide some form of order, a sense of understanding as to what this whole experience was. What is the world of nature, why it works the way it works. So they have to provide those types of answers by developing certain notions or certain beliefs. And this led to the development of the first religion ever developed in the world. Again, the first religion ever developed, that Native Americans developed, but pretty much all of the peoples of the world developed, was the religion called animism. Okay, animism. This is the first religion ever developed by human beings. Okay, human beings in the distant past, in the Stone Age, developed the very first religion that is going to serve as the basis for all of the other religions that will come much, much later. It's called animism. So what is animism? So animism is the belief that everything has a spirit. Okay, everything that exists in the world of nature, everything is endowed with a spiritual essence and is animated by that spirit. So a plant has a spirit. A tree has a spirit. A mountain has a spirit, its own spirit. The clouds of the sky are spirits. The thunder, the rain, the lightning are spirits. Animals have spirits. Humans have spirits. Everything has a spirit. This is how they explain, why things moved, why things were alive, why things existed in the world, is because spirits created them and they lived within matter. They live within everything that exists. Everything has a spirit force, a spirit entity, in other words, a spiritual or spirit entity. Everything is animated. So it's called animism. This is where, later on, religions that are going to come much later are going to derive their idea about the soul. Okay, that certain human beings have a soul, for example, or animals might have a soul, etc. It comes from this. It comes from this particular phase in humanity, the Stone Age, the hunters and gatherers, that developed the very seed idea of spirit and soul, that everything had a soul, not just humans, not just animals, but everything, even a piece of rock. Okay, even a piece of rock has its own soul. It's called animism. Everything is animated. Everything moves because there's spirits moving it. Okay, why is rain? Because there's spirits bringing the rain. Okay, the clouds are spirits moving through the sky. The wind is a spirit as well. Everything is a spirit. Now, the same religion of animism gave us the belief in what natives in other groups around the world call mana. This is also a universal concept that developed all over the world during this time, the concept of mana, and that is spiritual force. In that every spirit that inhabits nature has also a force, a spiritual force, mana. So the spirits that live in rocks have a force. Okay, the spirits in plants have a force. The spirits that live in water have a force, and trees, and so on. Different types of forces in different degrees. And the belief was that humans could actually tap into those forces to use them for different purposes. So humans can tap into the spiritual power, let's say, of rocks or gemstones, for example, because those gemstones have power, because there's a spirit living in it, and humans can actually use that power, let's say, for protection. Okay, and this is very common. not only among natives, but among many peoples, again, around the world, the use of gemstones for protection or for power, for healing, for example. The use of plants for healing, magical rituals for healing, for example, and so on. Driving out evil spirits from the body of a person by the use of herbs and so on, because of the mana of the plants, the spiritual power, and so on. It's very important. Again, this is going to be very important for understanding Native American thought, how Native Americans think about nature. Nature is alive because it has a spirit, and they also have a force. Certain places are sacred because those places are endowed with spiritual beings that dwell there, and they have a certain force that are provided to people that visit them, those places, and confer offerings to the spirits that live in the land, and people can actually tap into the mana, the force of those spirits. So Native Americans are going to create, ceremonial spaces in different parts of the landscape that they consider sacred, precisely because they see the land animated. They see the land alive in that it has spirits that live there, and if you feed those spirits, the spirits can give you mana. They can give you spiritual power. That is to say. So it's very important that we understand this. And of course, I'm going to continue, discussing this in session 2 and session 3 about animism and mana. But just be advised that this is fundamental to Native American religious thought. Almost anywhere in the Americas, they developed this idea, this notion. It's animism, everything is animated, everything is alive with spirits. In mana, that everything has a force. Also, the other thing that I want to discuss is the last thing I want to discuss in this first session is, again, that during the Stone Age, in the latter stages, by the way, of the Stone Age, what we're going to see is that we're going to see the emergence of shamans. Shamans or shamans are the spiritual guides, religious leaders of the Native American groups. Okay, they're not priests per se, not in this time. So they're not really a priesthood. There's not an organized priesthood and an organized religion of any kind, because they're, again, nomadic peoples traveling from place to place and so on. They're not very organized. But nonetheless, now that they have a religion, certain beliefs that they hold dear, they share in common about the world, there's going to be people that are going to come forth claiming that they have a special connection to the spirit world, that they can communicate with the spirits of the land, that they can tap into the power of the spirits, the mana. So those individuals are going to be respected, they're going to be followed, they're going to acquire a special status among natives, because people believe those individuals to be closer to the spirit world, closer to the power of nature. So they were looked after in terms of people following them, looking for protection, seeking in many cases their guidance. The shamans will lead us, they will guide us in society because, they communicate with the spirit world and so on. So we're going to see the early stages, again, of the religious representatives, the people that represented the group to the spirit world. And this is important because, as we'll see later on, the shamans or shamans are going to become so special among Native American groups that they're going to be elevated as the political leaders, political rulers. So without exception, when you look at the entire American continent, the entire American continent, the leaders of Native American groups, however small the group is and however large and organized and complex it will become, doesn't matter the size and the degree of their organization, the rulers and the leaders of those groups, without exception, they're all gonna be shamans or shamans. Okay, the shamans will eventually acquire political leadership. Okay, they will become the political rulers, the political leaders, the chiefs, again, of the tribes, of the group, etc. And even in some societies that develop, of course, a kingdom, they're going to become the kings as well. Okay, so this is very important, and the reason for that is because Native Americans developed this view of the world. They established the idea that everything is alive, everything is animated by spirits. The spirits have force, they have power, and those closer to that spirit world of nature can tap into the power of the spirits. They are the ones that have to lead society. Okay, they have power, they have knowledge, they have wisdom. They're chosen by the spirits to lead, so therefore they're going to be elevated again to political authority. And this is very important because this is going to occur everywhere in the Americas. Okay, so we're going to make a stop here. We have reached our an hour and 15 minute, so to speak, an hour and 20-minute mark. So we're going to actually stop here, and when we come back again, we're going to continue with session 2 of this topic. So next week, this is very important. Next week, I will post 2 more videos that will cover session 2 and session 3 of this topic. For this week, we're set. The first video I gave you was on class introduction, and now the second video is this. This is the first lecture of the first topic, of course. So for this week, we're set. Please take notes as thoroughly as possible, and I will be posting the next video on Monday of next week, following up on this lecture, and I will send you an email announcement again where we are. Again, every week I will be posting 2 videos again and announcing it to you. Okay, so that's all I have for you, and I'll see you then next week when we come back. Bye bye.